I am the Ascended Master Nada, and I wish to give you some perspective on the remark made by Jesus so many years ago when he said, "Woe unto ye lawyers." What does this mean for the golden age and for the bringing in of the golden age? Well, it means simply that the profession that you now see as the legal profession will have to change dramatically in order to align itself with the vision of Saint Germain. This, of course, must start not just with the lawyers who are, so to speak, interpreting the law, but also by the lawmakers who make the laws. What you have today is a tradition that is very, very old, where the purpose of making laws and the purpose of setting up a legal system, a court system that is interpreting these laws, is affected by the mindset of the fallen beings to such an extent that in many countries the real purpose of the entire system is to give special privileges to the ruling elite of people, or to give them a way to escape accountability. There is, of course, in many democratic nations, a certain limit to how they can set up the laws in order to give themselves privileges, because a democracy is based on the fundamental principle that all of its citizens should be equal to the law. Yet, even in democratic countries, there are always those who seek to create laws in such a way that they set up exceptions for certain people or certain segments of society. You have seen this especially with the business community, where there in many countries are certain corporations that are so big that they are considered too important for the country, so that the country cannot risk that they will either go down or move their businesses elsewhere. And therefore there is a tendency to create laws in such a way that these businesses are in effect given a favorable position. This is something that, of course, cannot exist in the golden age, and it is necessary for you to make calls on this, that there will be a rising awareness of the need to remove all such special privileges or exemptions in the laws of democratic countries, so that they do not favor particular businesses or organizations. This will require a change in the mindset, of course, but this will be brought about by other things that we will talk about and other calls you can make. For, of course, there needs to be a trust in the nations that we do not need to give special privileges to certain companies. We do not need to, in effect, give them monopolies in order for our economy to survive. There is today a widespread belief in many countries that the economy of certain nations simply could not survive without these huge corporations. And it is, of course, not correct, because it is indeed very possible that many smaller businesses can make up for the loss of one big business. And so it is a perception created by the fallen beings, again, in order to give them power and to give them privileges and maintain that privileges, so that they in effect do not have to run a business that is geared towards serving its customers, and therefore they can get away with this because there is no effective competition because of the favored position they have been given. Once you remove such barriers in the laws, then what remains is to look at the legal system and how the courts and the lawyers are interpreting and in many cases manipulating the laws. So when you look at democratic countries, it is not so difficult to bring about a situation where certain organizations no longer have these special privileges. But you still have the fact that you have created a culture in the legal system of most nations where those who are part of the legal system do not want to change the system in fundamental ways because they make their living off of that system. You know very well that in most countries the lawyers are often among the wealthiest people because they can charge very high fees. And they can charge high fees because the country has such a complicated set of laws and such a complicated legal system that in effect it gives a privileged position, even in some cases a kind of monopoly position, to the lawyers. They are the only ones who can interpret the system. And this, of course, you need to make calls on that countries will come to realize that this entire culture is based on a simple fact, namely that the law system, the system of the laws, is becoming increasingly complicated, increasingly large, and that there is simply an unnecessary burden of all of these laws that are becoming more and more complex in all countries. Now, obviously, you cannot, my beloved, create a very simple law in a complex country because there are many considerations that need to be put into the system of laws. Nevertheless, what you can make calls on is that people will realize the need to simplify the laws so that there is not as much room for interpretation. What often makes the law system complex is that the entire legal profession in a country has created a culture where, for example, they say that the laws must not discriminate, and in order to avoid discriminating, we have to write various conditions into the laws so that no one is discriminated against. But even this can be used not only to create complexity, but also to create a situation where the efforts to seemingly not discriminate actually become an openness for an almost endless interpretation of the laws, so that there is no clarity in how to implement these laws. And once you start creating such a complex system of laws that hardly anyone can interpret them, you end up in a situation where the people who are writing the laws often simply do not have the vision of how a new law they are creating might potentially contradict what is said in a previous law. And so you end up with these situations where everything is so complicated that no one can really foresee the consequences of a new law and how it might contradict with a previous law. And this again gives leeway for the lawyers to begin to interpret, and all of a sudden the laws that were meant to, for example, prevent discrimination against certain groups actually become a tool whereby those who can afford to hire the expensive lawyers can use the laws as a form of loophole where they can actually use the law that was meant to prevent discrimination to create a new form of discrimination where they themselves can manipulate the laws so that they are claiming a certain freedom that they are not entitled to, because they are not actually being discriminated against, but they are using it to set themselves up in an exempt position where they are not having to follow the same rules as others. I know, my beloved, that this is abstract, but I do not wish to go into giving you too many concrete examples, because again, this would become something that could be interpreted and interpreted and interpreted. So what I wish you to make calls on is that there is a need for the democratic nations to wake up and realize that they need to step back and look at their legal system and look how it is being misused by the lawyers to give exemptions to a small elite who can afford to pay the attorneys and to continue to pay these attorneys' fees and create these court cases that seem to go on forever and ever, but in the end up giving them special privileges that no ordinary citizen could ever claim, because they simply could not afford to pay the legal fees. And so what you have created here is a legal system that has become so complicated, and even though it is based on good intentions and preventing the discrimination against certain groups of people, the complication of the system, the level of complexity of the system, is actually reinforcing the situation where there is an upper class who can afford to play the legal game, and then there is the broad population who simply have no recourse because they cannot afford to run a court case that costs tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in legal fees. And so you end up creating this privileged position where those who can take advantage of the system do so, and therefore can set themselves up to either have privileges or to generate profits, because they can effectively destroy competition by running these lawsuits against their competitors that no smaller businesses can afford, and therefore the smaller businesses cannot challenge the older established businesses. There is also a tendency in most countries to create so many rules that, for example, businesses have to comply with, that this in itself creates a privileged position for the large businesses who can afford to hire the lawyers or the experts or build the facilities that are required. And so in essence, you have a situation where the legal system that actually was meant to protect the people is being used by large established businesses to destroy their competition, or to prevent the competition from even arising, because they cannot afford to comply with the elaborate rules. And so you see here that it is necessary for you to make the calls that there is a rising awareness. And again, we do not need people to know about ascended master teachings. We do not need them to understand the dynamic of the fallen beings. But it is not beyond the capability of the people in most nations to realize that there is always a power elite that is seeking to gain special power and privileges for themselves, and they will use any aspect of society, including the legal system and the bureaucratic system. And it is not beyond the capacity of most people to realize that for the ordinary citizen in a democratic country, it is in their best interest to have a relatively simple legal system and a relatively simple set of bureaucratic rules, so that they themselves can figure out what their rights are. it is certainly something to make calls on, that people will realize that the tendency to complicate everything, to complicate the legal system, to complicate the bureaucracy, only serves the elite, for they are the only ones who can afford to hire the attorneys to take advantage of this complex system. And they are using it over and over and over again to set themselves up so that the people cannot challenge them. And thereby this system of complexity creates a privileged position for the few and effectively shuts out the many from attaining these privileges. You will see in many nations how the rules that are set in place for establishing a new business in many areas are so complicated, so elaborate, and so expensive to comply with that a new business effectively cannot be started, or at least it cannot be started by a single person or a few people. It could only be started by someone who had enough experience and enough connections so that the person could manipulate the system, and so that the person could also gain financing from the major financial institutions. And this would then mean that such a business, in order to even get started, has to, so to speak, become part of the establishment. And so you will see that there has been created this privileged position where only those who are part of the establishment can start a new business. And in order to get that business going, they must then, as I said, become part of the establishment, which means they accept the establishment, the rules that they are based on, and they will perpetuate the system. They will not challenge the system. And so when you look back at the way many nations got their economies going, it was often that a single person could take the initiative and could start with very little capital and start a new business that eventually would grow to become a bigger business. But effectively, in many nations, this is no longer possible in the main areas of business. It is only possible in new areas, such as you, for example, saw a few decades ago with the computer industry, where anyone who had the expertise could start a new company, such as a software company, and simply by their know-how start a new business. And the reason for this was very simply that the old established businesses did not understand the computer industry in the beginning, did not see its potential, and therefore it was one of those rare opportunities for the small independent entrepreneur. And it is, my beloved, the small independent entrepreneurs that will drive the innovation that will bring about the new technology and the new business models in the golden age. For my beloved, have we not so many times talked about the power elite, that you realize, of course, that the new inventions and the new business models that are necessary in the golden age are not likely to be brought by the huge established businesses, for they are more concerned about protecting their position and their interests than bringing forth something new. We have talked about the fact that there are many businesses who become so large and they become so complicated that they cannot invent. And you see why. It is simply because when a business becomes so big that it becomes a part of the establishment in a country, then it is inevitable that the business that is taking advantage of a complicated legal system will itself have to create a set of internal rules. And these will also become more and more complicated, so that the business itself eventually becomes so bogged down in these internal procedures that there is no room for invention, there is no room for creativity, And therefore it begins to, as we have said, have this process of unnatural selection where it selects out the people who can invent and selects in the people who are willing to follow rules. And so you see that it is clear that for Saint Germain's golden age to be manifest, many new business methods, business visions, much new technology needs to be brought forth. But this is not likely to be brought by the big established companies because they either will not see a new invention as a possibility, or they will see it as a threat to their business and therefore want to suppress it. And so you need to make the calls for this entire conglomerate, because there are some very, very powerful demons and collective entities that have been created by these huge corporations. You can make the calls for this in every country, of course, because every country is affected by this, but you especially need to make calls for the binding and the consuming of the demons behind the big multinational corporations. Here in South Korea, you need to make calls for the big business conglomerates that you have nationally, that they will be exposed and that their privileged will be removed. But you also need to be aware, as does every nation, that there are these huge international, multinational corporations that are simply seeking to take over the economy in any country. You will see that these corporations will move in. If you study, for example, the situation in Eastern Europe after the fall of communism, you will see that in every country, these big multinational corporations attempted to move in and dominate the business world because they had the capital. They could afford to hire the attorneys, and they wanted to make sure that they would take over the market in these newly freed up economies, instead of having a situation where the local people would act as entrepreneurs and start up businesses that eventually would take over most of the market. Instead, the big multinationals wanted to dominate these markets, and they were in many countries allowed to establish this form of dominance. Well, it is time, of course, for you who are students to make the calls for this and to increase people's awareness of the need to limit, as Saint Germain has said before, the size of corporations so that they cannot become so powerful that they can begin to influence the political process in democratic nations. You especially need to make the calls for the multinational corporations, because it is one thing to have a national business that influences that nation's business, because that national business may at least have some loyalty to the country in which it was established. But when you look at these large multinational corporations, they have no loyalty to any nation nor to any people, and they are simply looking at the people as either employees that they can use and take advantage of, or as customers where they would like to establish themselves in a monopoly so that the people effectively have very little choice. You also need to make the calls that people have become aware of this as consumers so that they can make wiser choices, my beloved. To give you an obvious example, you can see that even though there are two multinational corporations that sell soft drinks, they have in many countries attempted to, so to speak, divide the territory so that they can tolerate each other, but they shut out any competing companies so that even though the people have a choice, the only choice is the choice between Pepsi or Coca-Cola. And that really isn't the kind of choices that we would like to see in the Aquarian age. And so, my beloved, these are areas that it is important for you to make calls on, because it is clear that in the golden age, the legal system will be of the people, by the people, for the people, not of the elite, by the elite, and for the elite, as it is today in most nations. It is not that I in any way want to promote a negative view of lawyers and attorneys, as you see in some countries, but it is obvious that there are some countries where the people are beginning to be aware that attorneys have set themselves up in such a position where they are interpreting and manipulating the laws endlessly, and therefore they are able to command these enormous fees without in the end being able to really give people a just treatment in the legal system. And it is clear that there are nations where people are becoming more and more aware that they cannot get real justice in the court system because the attorneys can come up with interpretations that, in a sense, paralyze the judges from making just judgments. And this is a situation to make calls on so that there is a simplification of the legal system where, again, the rules become more clear. Have you done something that is illegal? Well, then you will be held accountable for that according to the rules of the system. Whereas today it is so that if you are a person without much money, you may be held accountable by the law, but if you have enough money to hire the attorneys, then you will not be held accountable. Of course, you also can make the calls that there will be a rising awareness where the people will refuse to, so to speak, use the legal system to gain a personal advantage over other people. You see so many times, my beloved, where there are personal disagreements between different people. It can be in business dealings, it can be in divorce cases, it can be in inheritance, or many other things. And you will see that the people are so eager to sue each other as a way to get back at the other side. But what in most cases happens is that both sides end up paying enormous legal fees, and there is really no decisive outcome of the case, precisely because of the conditions and the complexity of the legal system, which makes it impossible to make these just judgments. And so you can make the calls for this also, and that there is an awareness here that the people are not sucked in by these beasts, by these conglomerate entities, collective entities that have been created by the legal system. Because this has been created because those who are part of the system want to perpetuate their existence, they want to make more and more money, and therefore there has been created these entities in the emotional realm, especially that are so good at putting hooks into people's auras, into their emotional bodies, and making them angry so that they want to sue each other because they think that they will get some kind of justice. But there is, in many cases, in these disagreements, no justice. And the only solution here is not even to create a better legal system, because it would be impossible to create a legal system that could settle every disagreement between the people in a nation. There are simply so many disagreements that people can come up with that any system would be bogged down by the volume of disagreements when people are in this state of consciousness. And therefore you can make the calls for the binding of these demons and entities so that the people will be cut free, and they will see that the real solution to these personal disagreements is not to go to the courts, but to raise your own consciousness. And you can make the calls that people become aware that they need to make a very realistic assessment here of what they want out of these disagreements. because the simple karmic consequence of engaging in these legal battles with other people is that you tie yourself to these people karmically. Regardless of what the outcome of a court case may be, you are tying yourself karmically to the people you are suing. And you need to therefore be realistic and say, do I want to tie myself to these people so that I may have to reincarnate with them again in my next lifetime? Or do I want to be free of these people so that I can move on? Because in that case, I might need to look to raise my own consciousness so I can see a different way to approach this situation. And so you can make the calls that people will rise to this new awareness that there are better ways to settle things between them. And you can even make calls for the awareness that if you go back just a few decades, there was in most nations not the tradition for suing each other that you see today. And therefore people can begin to ask themselves, well, how come we could settle things back then without going to court, and now all of a sudden we have to go to court about everything? What is it that has changed in our psychology, in our national psychology, that we have suddenly become so sue-happy that we are suing each other at every opportunity? And it is indeed possible for you to make these calls, and there can be an awakening where people begin to realize that things have simply gone too far, and it is necessary to return to some original principles, or even to rise up to some new principles that makes it possible for people to be able to communicate openly and freely so that they can settle differences without having to take recourse with attorneys who are not giving them recourse because they are only complicating matters. You can make the calls that people are awakened to the fact that the primary goal of many attorneys is to complicate a case so that they can extract more legal fees. Because the longer it goes on, the more money they make. And the attorneys in many cases do not care about the outcome for the people. They do not care about justice. And you need to make the calls also for the binding of these entities and demons that are enveloping the legal profession in many countries, where the attorneys, even if they started out with a certain sense of idealism, have, so to speak, sold their soul to the devil because they have become so disillusioned with the entire legal system that they do not anymore care about their ideals and principles, because they realize that in most cases they cannot give justice to their clients. And so they have decided that since this is their profession, and since they went to school and this is the only thing they know, they are just in it for the money. And you can make the calls for the binding of these entities that are overshadowing the minds of these attorneys and other people involved with the system, and you will see that there can indeed be a change towards a golden age system where the laws are simple, the laws are clear, the laws do not give exemptions to those who can afford to hire attorneys. There is no room for interpretation whereby a privileged elite can gain and maintain privileges, and where there is an attitude to the legal system that this is only a last recourse, and you in fact create a system of mediation among people where there is more effective ways to settle conflicts than by going to court. Because you realize, my beloved, that in the present situation, a courtroom procedure is such a complicated interaction of energy, of demons, of collective entities, of the emotional bodies of the people involved, of the mental bodies of especially the attorneys, that the entire situation is so complex that the chances of creating any form of higher justice here is very, very remote. And so when you realize this, you can see that there's a need for a new awareness for creating an entirely different system that actually appeals to people's discernment rather than their anger or their emotions of wanting to get back to people. The only way to create a completely justice system is to create a situation where the judges have a certain measure of Christ's discernment, but even the people need to have some Christ discernment to know what is in their own best long-term interest. So my beloved, these are indeed complicated matters, and I realize it is easy to overwhelm you, and I have no desire to make you feel burdened by this personally. I simply have a desire to make you aware of what you can make calls for, and then you make the calls, and then you allow us to step in and bring forth the changes that can be brought forth, because you have cleared the energetic pathway whereby this awareness can descend all the way to the physical, and once again people wake up and say, oh, this is obvious, we now see it. Do you see, my beloved, that one of the underlying themes for radiating the Golden Age consciousness is that you, who are students, become the electrodes for radiating these energies from us, these ideas from us, and it clears the three higher bodies of the planet so that those people who have the potential from past lifetimes suddenly wake up and see how obvious a certain change is. This is what it really means to radiate the Golden Age consciousness. It is not that you force anything upon people, it is simply that you set them free to see the obvious. And when they know better, they will do better, and they will know better as soon as they are not overwhelmed by this cloud of lower energy that clogs up the flow from the ascended realm through the identity, mental, emotional realm and into the physical level where they can consciously recognize the validity of a new idea. So with this, I give you my gratitude for being the electrodes, for radiating this, not only here in Korea, but throughout the world. For this is, of course, a planetary problem. But I can assure you that those of you who are here have radiated an extraordinary measure in your own nation here in Korea. And when you reinforce it with your calls, you will begin to see changes happening, my beloveds. Thus, I give you my gratitude for enjoying this long discourse.